بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Inshallah, in today's lecture, we're going to take or cover chapter 22 and to talk about how the Quran addresses, deals with, and talks about the created world around us, al-kawn. So this will be a little bit of more of a scientific nature. What does the Quran teach us about scientific phenomena, physical phenomena, the creation of the heavens and the earth, and things like that? We talked way back when we talked about the tafsir, the different type of tafsirs that we found. We talked about one of the approaches of modern tafsir is to have a scientific approach, and we had a little bit of a critique of that and some of the limitations of that. So in a way, we're going to pick up that topic here in this chapter and then talk about uh, aspects of the Quran that talk about the created world around us and how we could properly uh, weigh those passages and understand them. And then we will end with some comments about potential tafsir. Then following that, we will jump into chapter 23. We won't get through all of it, but chapter 23 basically talks about the stories of the Quran. And Allah Ta'ala tells us these are the ahsan al-qasas, these are the best of stories. So in this chapter, we want to look at what types of stories are in the Quran, why we have the stories in the Quran, some of the unique features of the stories of the Quran. Like you rarely have a story in its entirety, its parts. There's repetition to some of the stories. Some of the repetitions have some changes or slight variances, not changes. And so those are some of the unique features about the stories, the Quranic stories. Now, if you look at the Quran, both the natural phenomena, the first part of what we're going to talk about, and the story part, those make up the vast majority of the Quran. So these two chapters, or this lecture and probably the next one, are one of the more important ones in this entire course, because this is actually what most people will encounter when they read the Quran. So inshallah, I hope that you will benefit from it as I did preparing for the class, and I'll see you back here inshallah for the first clip. All right, so chapter 22, Al-Kawnu fil Quran, the created world around us in the Quran. Right off the bat, one of the things that is very unique to the Quran, especially when you approach it for the first time. When I say the first time, I don't mean the absolutely first time, but the first times, like you're just getting used to reading the Quran, is that the Quran makes a lot of references to the natural phenomena around us. It makes references to the sun and to the moon and to the stars and to the creation of the heavens and the earth. It makes references to the evolving of the night and day into night. It talks about life and talks about death. It talks about corruption appearing on land and on earth. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. By the seeds that we sow ourselves, so on and so forth. So there's a glaring, obvious discussion throughout the Quranic verses and throughout the surahs of the Quran about the natural phenomena around us. Now, this is, as somebody who has studied other religions, this is unique. This is a unique feature of the Quran, because a lot of the other texts, a lot of the other sacred and holy texts do not necessarily speak with this in this way about those natural phenomena, nor with that type of frequency. So that's one thing, right off the bat. That's why we have to talk about it, because it's something that's so obvious. A second thing is that in talking about those things, the Quran does not give us a scientific theory or paradigm that we're stuck to, which is one of the signs of its miraculous nature. Because if the Quran was written by somebody, produced by somebody, put together by a committee of scholars, undoubtedly, when it comes to these issues, they would have added their whatever at the time was their understanding of these phenomena. They would have added their theory or their commentaries about those things. But the Quran doesn't even address necessarily directly the theories of these natural phenomena as was understood by the Arabs at the time of the revelation. It goes way beyond that. It's talking about it in another way completely. And that is one of the signs of the miracles of the Quran, is that it's completely outside of time. Yes, it mentions that there's idol worship, and it mentions, some of the corrupt practices of the people of Quraysh. The little girl that's been buried alive, may Allah Ta'ala protect us, will ask Yawm al-Qiyamah, why was I killed? The Quran does make references to those practices. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But there's no overarching theory. There's no, this is the Big Bang theory, or that this is the theory of evolution. The Quran talks about them in a completely Quranic way. We can only describe it as the Quranic way. And that's one of the powers of the Quran, is that it emphasizes for us that it's not written by a person, didn't come from a person, but it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it came from the Creator. So when we talk about the natural phenomena in the Quran, this is also something that I want you to pay attention to. Now, in talking, just to round off what I was just saying, in talking about, or not pinning a certain theory, scientific theory to these things, one of the things that the Quran is doing by mentioning them is encouraging us to go and research and to look into these things. So, from a high level, the references in the Quran to the natural phenomena, to the world, to the created world around us, is a reference twofold. Is a reference to show the grandeur of Allah Ta'ala's creation, and is meant to trigger within us the quest to understand and to learn. وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. The people that remember Allah lying down, sitting, and standing, or standing, sitting down, lying rather, and contemplate the heavens and the earth. Allah, you have not created this in jest. Praise be to you, and save us from the hellfire. So the natural world around us is supposed to trigger within us the search. Well, what is that? Where did that come from? How? So it pushes. The Quran is encouraging us to inquire about these things. Okay, now let's look at some of the principles that the Quran has in talking about the world around us, natural phenomena. The Quran is not a book of science, obviously. It's a book of guidance. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. This is a book of guidance. So the focus of the Quran is not on explaining the natural phenomena. The focus of the Quran is guiding us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the signposts on that pathway to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the created world. So it's one big ayah, it's one big sign. The other thing is to keep in mind is that natural sciences, the theories of these things change with the evolution of our understanding of the world around us. And because it changes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not given us specifics on these things to leave it open for us to unfurl those mysteries, to seek out the quest of learning and understanding and building, just like any other profession. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't give us the details of medicine, but He tells us, in honey is shifa, in the book is shifa. There are many hadith that, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi has the whole book of Tibb al-Nabawi, the prophetic medicine, which is also translated into English. So think of it in that way, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala references the things that are important for humanity, these like different tasks and jobs and trades and professions, but doesn't give us the specifics because it's upon us to open up the path. So again, this is just to repeat what I was saying in the beginning, that you will find a lot of the references to the natural phenomena to be specific, to be general and not specific. Number 3 is that the Quran posits that the universe around us is made for us. It has been prepared for us, what we call a taskhir. So the world around us is happening for us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us to be a sayyid in the kawn, to be a master in the universe, not the master of the universe, not sayyidul kawn. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But to be a sayyid in the kawn, we are definitely a leading species, obviously, because we're the ones that can only do this. So therefore, the world around us, whether it be the earth that we occupy or I like to use the word observable universe, so it widens it completely, has been made for us. And therefore, because it's been made for us, we are meant to interact with it. And because we are meant to interact with it, we are meant to know more about it and to keep the balance, the mizan that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the world in. Number 4, just to repeat what I said in the beginning comments, that there is no specific scientific theory that the Quran is going to posit when it comes to the natural world around us, simply because the natural world around us are signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our understandings of them and our theories of them are always going to be limited with what we know today. They're not going to be, these theories are not going to be absolute. So that's something that you're not going to find that in the Quran. Allah ta'ala will just give us facts about the creation of the heavens and the earth, but will not necessarily give us the theory behind it. Again, it's a quest for us to know. And therefore, the verses of a scientific nature allow us to take those to our theories and give us a deeper meaning of the Quran. So one example that he gives, for example, is وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقْنَا زَوْجَيْنِ اثْنَيْنِ لَعَلَكُمْ تَذَكُّرُونَ. Allah Ta'ala says we've created a pair from everything. Now we usually understand the pair as like night and day, darkness and light, man and woman. But then when we started to understand the atomic theory, protons and electrons and neutrons and things like that, but there's also the pairing within the cell itself from an energy point of view. So the verse gives us a concept that Allah Ta'ala has created everything in pairs. And then Allah is as if Allah is saying, now go, O you human beings, my creation, and look and find those pairs. So that's the relationship between the verses and the theory. I'll pick it up in the next clip, inshallah. So I ended the last clip talking about the verses of the pairs, that Allah Ta'ala has created everything in a pair. And this is a fact, not a theory. So this is like a concept. So the believers are, okay, there's a pairing in everything. So therefore, if I'm a scientist or I want to contemplate the world around me, I'm going to look for those pairs. So the obvious pair is a man and woman. And then the couplings of things like the day and the night, light and darkness, the obvious pairs. But then, as I mentioned at the end of the last clip, when we have issues of modern, our understanding of the atomic theory and being able to look at things at a greater detail, microscopic, at a microscopic level, then we see that there are pairs within the cell. The pairs of energy between the electrons and the protons, and then there's the neutrons to make things interesting, and photons, and then you get even deeper, and then there's the quantum level things. So you also find the pairings in that. So this is a very good verse and a very good example to show how the Quran is not going to teach us a scientific theory, but is rather going to give us a fact about the creation, i.e. the world around us, and then we are meant to go out and figure that stuff out and look into it. Okay, now just a note on tafsir, scientific tafsir. I smiled because I think I've mentioned I'm not really a fan of it, but let's just put it out there because somebody might be interested in doing it. In the past, we used to have a problem. It's not so much a problem now, but it did exist at a time in Islamic history, that there was this movement, this Batini movement, which was to negate the outward expression and meaning of the Quran and the Sunnah, and to only seek the hidden meaning on the inside of those things. Al-Batin. Now, we believe that there is a batin to all of the verses, and that there's a batin to the Sharia. We call that a tasawwuf, or a tariqa, or a haqiqa. But as we've learned, and as we will come to learn when we take these different subjects together, inshallah, one by one, is that the the haqiqah, the internal, the batin cannot negate the zahir. The zahir doesn't negate the batin, and the batin doesn't negate the zahir. You need the zahir, you need the external to take, it's like a buoy on top of a water, and below that buoy there's like an anchor. The anchor will take you follow the rope. I mean, I know it's not a perfect example because the buoy actually just floats. So let's say it's a ship and then the anchor. It's a better example. The ship is the zahir. It's got to be there. And then what's holding that ship down is the anchor that goes all the way down to the bed of the sea. That's the batin. They're connected. They can't not be. You can't get to that anchor without having the zahir to indicate it as a sign. Hello, up top, I am the zahir. Below me, you will find the batin. So the people that do the scientific, reason I mention this is that the people that want to do tafsir of the Quran on the scientific level, they can't negate the zahir of the Quran. Allah Ta'ala created things in pairs. He created things in pairs. It means what it means. Remember we talked about the muhkam and the mutashabih. This is pretty clear stuff. So you can't negate that and say, no, there's an internal theory. The Quran is really talking about a theory of this or a theory of that. And that's the second point. So the first point is you can't negate the zahir. The second point is you can't impose a scientific theory on the Quran, but rather your reading of the Quran and understanding of the Quran triggers your understanding scientifically of the verses. So who's leading the dance? Is it the scientific theory? That's going to be problematic. Or is it your understanding of the Quran? We have now over 1,400 years of tafsir legacy that we can look at. What does the Quran mean or these verses mean? Then I can bring in the theory to it and somehow pair them if at all possible. So those are 2 points to think about when it comes to the scientific tafsir of the Quran. I don't think there should be this is me, Tariq speaking, I don't think there should be a scientific tafsir of the Quran, but I certainly advocate that we compile the verses that have to do with natural phenomena, and we see them as principles. These are our first principles when it comes to the observable sciences, and therefore how do those first principles manifest and translate in the observable sciences? I think that would be a more constructive way. Okay, let's cross over now into chapter 23, Al-Qisas fil Quran, the stories of the Quran. Now, the Quran is full of stories, and what makes the Quran easy, one of the things that makes it easy to memorize, enjoyable to read always, are reading the stories in the Quran. The main function of the stories of the Quran are to establish the veracity of the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ, to demonstrate that this is a revelation, because the stories that are in the Quran are not stories that the Prophet ﷺ knew. That's really important. And they were partially known by the people of the book, for example, like when it comes to the story of Moses or something like that. But it's not like everybody knew who Moses and Abraham was at that time in Arabia. Remember that in Mecca, almost everyone was a pagan. There were a few people that were on the ad-din al-Hanif, like the pure monotheistic Abrahamic religion. But that was about it, just sort of like we believe in one God. But the details of these stories, no one knew these kind of things. Not even the Jews knew these type of things, because our versions of the story that you find in the Quran have details that are not even in those versions of the story. Number two, the point of the stories is to show us that the good guys win at the end. Right? The prophets win, alayhim as-salam. Despite all of the difficulty and the turmoil and the tribulation and the taunting and the persecution and the pain so despite all of that, at the end of all of that, the flip side of all of that, the good guys always win. Alhamdulillah. So the prophets win, alayhim as-salam, and Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ won, and the believers with him. And inshallah, if we hold ourselves to those standards, we will end up winning at the end, in this life and in the hereafter. So, it sounds like it's a no-brainer, but it's important that we remember that that's one of the points of the story, is to show us who's going to lose and who's going to win. Number three is that through the stories, we get these principles of religion. Look, one of the verses that he cites is he doesn't have the verse citing, but this is the believer in Pharaoh's camp who hid his faith. كَانَ يَكْتُمُ إِيمَانَهُ. He used to hide his faith. أَتَقْتُلُونَ رَجُلًا أَنْ يَقُولَ رَبِّيَ اللَّهُ. You're going to kill somebody because he says Allah is my Lord. So in the middle of the story, we get this like principle, and this actually causes Pharaoh to stay the punishment against Musa alayhi salam. It's a concept that of how to negotiate, a concept of how to not persecute somebody because of their beliefs, etc. Number 4, that the stories explain to us aspect of the ancient history that are not found in the other books or the other religious traditions. The main part of this is to dispel the narrative that humanity was born or came into existence in a simple, rudimentary way, worshipped the animated world around them, and created idols and gods for all of the phenomena around them. And then came religion and monotheism and things like that, kind of like later. This is part of a larger concept or theory of evolution that wants to argue that we are the best version of our species today. And the only way you can do that is to show that our relatives were super primitive, super basic, and had no concept, no sophisticated concept of how to deal with the world around us, and therefore they worship the wind, they worship the water, then that narrative exists. It's not going to be as clear and as reductive as I just stated it, but that's actually major part of the Western world and the modern paradigm. That's actually what's the engine behind it, is this unbelievable, unwavering belief in this kind of evolution, and that we are always evolving. Well, the Quran dispels that from the stories, because we do not believe that we were unsophisticated. As a matter of fact, we believe that Sheath, one of the sons of Adam alayhi salam, was the one who brought Seth in the Hebrew Bible, who brought engineering and reading and writing and things like that. So we do not believe that the ancients were primitive at all. Rather, we look at time as it being like cyclical. There's ups and there's downs. Let me pick it up and explain what I mean in the next and final clip, inshallah. So this concept of this overarching narrative of evolution, that somehow our ancestors were primitive and then we're like the super version of our ancestors. One of the points of the stories of the stories of the Quran is to dispel that there was, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. Adam knew all the names of everything, the usages of everything. So if anything, Adam was more knowledgeable than we were, in spades, because he knew everything. Allah Ta'ala taught him everything. So that idea of that false evolutionary narrative is completely and this is a very clever thing that the Shaykh Nuruddin rahimahullah brings, and I'm really glad he wrote this in the book. It's a very clever point, is that the stories of the Anbiya negate all of that. One of the reasons this is significant is, Allah Ta'ala tells us in the Quran, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. The days revolve and exchange between people. There's a cycle to human history. So the idea that it was low and it's just getting better, and it's just going to forever get better, and then we'll get to a point where we don't need religion, we don't need, that's completely false. There are many aspects of modern life that are more primitive than the quote-unquote primitives of the past. So one of the points of the stories of the Quran is to show us this aspect and to negate this overarching theory of humanity, which is something that's very important. Okay, now another aspect of the stories of the Quran, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, is that these are actual historic stories. Okay, so the stories of the Quran are not metaphors, and they're not meant to be interpreted metaphorically, but these are actual historical, literal events. There might be details of the stories that we don't know, Of course, the stories have multiple levels of meanings. There are many meanings and layers of meanings to the stories. I mean, that goes without saying. So that's one thing. But it's not a metaphor. There actually was a man named Nuh alayhi salam, and he had this situation. Now, did the flood encompass all of earth or not all of earth? I mean, we have no text to say this or that. So from that point of view, and a lot of Muslims, they get tripped up on these things. Hold to the prima facie narrative of the story in the Quran and the Sunnah. Don't assume, don't make an assumption and then negate the assumption, and then by negating your false assumption, you're negating the whole thing. We don't know how deep the water was, how long the water was. There are traditions that are weak that talk about that, but there's no need for us to hold to those beliefs. We're talking here about, was there a man named Nuh or not? There was a man named Nuh, absolutely, historically. Was there a man named Ibrahim or not? There was a man named Ibrahim alayhi salam, so on and so forth. So, I mean, it might sound weird having to say this, but we believe that these stories are literal. Related to that is that the Quran also tells us about, extinct people like Hud, Ad, Thamud, Salih, people that were not for the revelation of the Quran would have not even been, most likely, Allahu Alam of course, most likely will not have been remembered throughout human history. So that's another unique feature about the historical nature of the stories of the Quran. He mentions, he ends this little section, he talks about Pharaoh and how the body of Pharaoh is displayed in the Cairo National Museum, which I've seen many times. And, there are different tafsirs. نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ فَالْيَوْمَ نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ. Today we will save your body. لِتَكُونَ لِمَنْ خَلْفَكَ آيَةً. So that you will be a sign of those people after you. But there are people that are into what you can call like religious archaeology. People that will want to, where is the boat of Nuh? Is it that thing, that structure on Mount Ararat in Turkey or not? Where is the body of Pharaoh? And this is, I'm not personally, as Tariq, very interested in it, but I mean, when those articles come and those pictures come, I have to admit, I look at them and I get excited. But I mean, I wouldn't be like the Indiana Jones of Islamic archaeology, but it's certainly a field, and a noble field, and something that's important, because there's a lot of Christians and now Jewish actors in that space. And what's going to happen is that they are going to try to rewrite parts of their scripture and parts of the stories to skew it, to their agenda. So Muslims getting involved in that is something that's actually important. This is not in the book, but this is just it just came to me as I'm talking to you now. This is an aspect that is very important for people to do. So I was just thinking about Moses and Pharaoh and the mummy in the National Cairo Museum. Okay, al-Muhim. Let's now turn to the final part of this lecture today, which is talk about the style of the stories in the Quran. The first thing is that the stories do not all appear in toto, right? There's not like, okay, in this surah, this is the entire story of Nuh alayhi salam, or the entire story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, with the exception, of course, of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. I think, it's safe to say that 98% of the stories in that surah, I think there's one or two references to Yusuf elsewhere in the Quran, but it's only a verse here or there. So that's a unique feature. I mean, it can drive you crazy if you're a little bit OCD like me, and why can't you just have it all? Why can't it be the chapter of Nuh, the chapter of Ibrahim, the chapter of Hud, etc.? It's not like that. It's interspersed throughout. And obviously there's going to be a hikmah. As we said in the past, everything in the Quran is done with precision and on purpose. So obviously there's a hikmah, there's a reason why that's the case. And part of that is that we get pieces here and we're paying attention to it, that we link them together, and that we are on our toes to anticipate when the conclusion will come. Another feature is that the stories are fused with lessons. So it's not just the narrative of the story, but in the narrative of the story, Allah Ta'ala gives us the lessons. We don't have to sort of sit here and have a conference to think about what the lesson is. Allah Ta'ala is telling us. So for example, وَإِذْ قَالَ لُقْمَانَ لِابْنِهِ وَهُوَ يَعِظُهُ يَا بُنَيَّ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ إِنَّ الشِّرْكَ لَظُلْمٌ عَظِيمٌ. So Luqman is advising his son, don't commit shirk. It's a great injustice. And then in the surah we says, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ, and we advise the people to be good to their parents in that same surah. So it's to emphasize that Luqman's son needs to listen to Luqman's advice. So Allah is being very upfront. This is the lesson, part of the lesson of that story is there. Okay. A third aspect of the stories of the Quran is the repetition. And again, repetition is something that will happen, but it's not something that's done. It's done on purpose, is what I'm trying to say. So the story will be repeated, like the story of Moses is repeated a lot. The story of Ibrahim is repeated a lot. You have some repetition to the story of Nuh alayhi salam, but Moses is the greatest story. The greatest story of the Quran, with the exception of Yusuf alayhi salam, which is in very meticulous detail. It's almost like a script. You can make a movie just based on that narrative alone. The Moses and Bani Israel is the biggest repetition. And then you have also repetition of statements like, Surah Al-Rahman, فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ, and this is also done for rhetorical purposes, and sometimes things are repeated with some differences. So you will find repetition of certain words, certain verse structures, and that's an indication that you pair them together to understand that, to compare and to contrast the differences. So for example, he says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُم مِّنْ إِمْلَاقٍ نَحْنُ نَرْزُقَكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ. And in another verse, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةَ إِمْلَاقٍ نَحْنُ نَرْزُقَهُمْ وَإِيَّاكُمْ. So in the first, it's about not harming your children for fear of poverty. In the first verse, Allah says, we will support you and them. نَرْزُقَكُمْ, Allah is addressing the parents, we will support you and them. And then in the second verse, Allah will support them and then you. So why is there a reversal? Even though the basic verse is repeated. One of the Mufassirun will say, this one is to negate fear of providing for your children now, or fear in the second verse of providing for your children in the future. So everything is done with precision. So when you find something that's repetitive, you need to find out, is it repetitive verbatim or not? And then if it's not repetitive verbatim and there are some differences, what might be some of the reasons behind that? Okay, we'll put a pin in it here, and in tomorrow's lecture we'll round out the stories of the Quran. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's lecture, we talked about the natural phenomena, the universe around us, the created world around us, how it's discussed in the Quran, and we looked at some of the science of the Quran, if you want to use that term, and how we interpret these concepts. We learned that the Quran is not a book of science, of course, it's a book of revelation and guidance, but Allah Ta'ala mentions these things in the Quran because these are from His great signs, from the grandeur of His creation, Jalla wa Ala, and they are to instigate within us the quest to learn and to understand what's behind the creation. Then we talked a little bit about how some the verses provide us with facts, and therefore we can take those facts and then go to the observable science appropriate to that fact and observe that fact in the different levels of the science based on our different understanding of the science. So it's not like something that Allah Ta'ala gives us a verse of a theory and then we have to prove or disprove the theory. He's just simply, these are the facts. And that Allah Ta'ala keeps this open for us so that we have the opportunity to go and to explore and to learn. Then following that, we started to talk about the stories of the Quran, Qisas al-Quran, and we talked about how the Quran has the best stories, that the stories are meant to give victory to the Prophet ﷺ by showing the veracity of his message. The stories show us that the good guys end up winning, not the bad, so there's a call for us to be patient. The Quranic stories tell us about things of the people in the past that no one knows about. It also tells us about people in the past or stories of the past that were incorrectly narrated to humanity. And then most importantly, we spent a lot of time talking about that the Quranic stories negate the narrative that we were somehow this primitive, creature worshipping all the things around us, and then we are never endingly evolving upwards. That kind of evolution of mankind in that sense is completely negated by the stories, simply because Allah Ta'ala created Adam, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. Allah Ta'ala created Adam and taught him the names and the usage of all things. So the stories of the Quran negate that and shows that there's a cyclical nature of time, ups and downs, ups and downs. And then we talked about at the very end some of the repetitive aspects of the stories in the Quran, and how about things don't happen in the Quran in vain. It's repeated for a purpose, and sometimes there's slight differences, and then those differences instigate and trigger for us a quest of understanding what's the difference between that and this. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.